Don't sit there. I'm not spending lunch beside a man nobody here can explain.
This is my seat. My name is on the card, and I'm staying right here.
Please. A printed card doesn't make you part of this table or this family.
Brooke raised her middle finger, annoyed and disgusted.
I'm not asking to be part of your family. I'm asking you to act with basic respect.
Respect? You walked in alone, sat beside me, and expected everyone to pretend that made sense.
Isaiah didn't move. The guests went quiet as Brooke's parents stood behind her, smiling.
Fine. Sit there and embarrass yourself until I have security drag you away.
Brooke Harlan had no idea the man she was shaming held her family's $850 million future in his hands. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The Harlan estate sprawled across 10 manicured acres like a golden kingdom. White silk tents dotted the emerald lawn. Crystal chandeliers hung from oak branches. 500 guests in designer suits and flowing dresses moved between champagne stations and flower arrangements that cost more than most people's cars. Isaiah Mercer stepped through the main gate at exactly noon. His navy suit was perfectly tailored but not flashy. His black leather shoes were polished but not expensive enough to draw attention. He carried no entourage, no security detail, no assistant with a clipboard. Just a man walking alone through a crowd of billionaires. The event coordinator checked his invitation twice. Her smile flickered when she saw his name, but she recovered quickly. Mr. Mercer, welcome to the Harlan Foundation's annual Harbor Renewal Celebration. Your table is right up front. She led him past tables of oil executives, tech moguls, and political donors, past waiters carrying silver trays of lobster rolls and imported wine, past security guards in black suits who watched every movement without seeming to notice anything at all. The front table sat beneath a cascade of white roses. Gold name cards marked each seat in elegant script. Isaiah found his place setting between B. Harlan and an empty chair reserved for the mayor's wife. He pulled out his chair and sat down without ceremony. The linen tablecloth was spotless. The silverware gleamed. Fresh gardenias floated in crystal bowls between the wine glasses. Isaiah straightened his napkin and began to study the room with the methodical attention of someone who noticed everything. Security positions, 2 guards by the main entrance, 1 near the stage, 3 roaming the perimeter. Cameras, mounted on light poles, handheld by event photographers, cell phones in every guest's manicured fingers. Exit routes, main gate, service entrance behind the kitchen tent, emergency gap in the hedge near the parking area. Across the garden, Conrad Harlan held court beneath the largest tent. The billionaire real estate magnate was 70 pounds heavier than his magazine photos suggested, but his silver hair and custom tuxedo made him look like old money royalty. He gestured widely as he spoke, his voice carrying over the string quartet. The Harbor Renewal Project represents everything our foundation stands for, Conrad announced to a circle of investors. Community partnership, economic opportunity, legacy development that honors both progress and tradition. Beside him, Renata Harlan nodded with practiced grace. Her champagne-colored dress probably cost more than a teacher's monthly salary, but she wore it like she was doing charity work just by being beautiful. Her smile never wavered as she touched arms, kissed cheeks, and whispered the kind of compliments that made donors feel special enough to write bigger checks. The guests laughed at Conrad's jokes. They applauded his vision. They raised their glasses when he toasted the bright future of Harlan Harbor. Isaiah watched it all without expression. He noted names, faces, relationships. He memorized who deferred to whom, who seemed nervous, who looked bored beneath their polite smiles. His mother had taught him that rich people's parties always revealed more than rich people intended. A flash of red caught his attention. Brooke Harlan emerged from the main house like she was walking down a runway. Her designer dress hugged every curve. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves over her bare shoulders. Diamond earrings caught the sunlight as she moved through the crowd, accepting compliments and air kisses like they were her natural right. She headed straight for the front table, her heels clicking against the stone pathway. Her smile was magazine perfect until she saw Isaiah sitting in the chair beside hers. The smile vanished. Her blue eyes narrowed as she looked him up and down, taking in his dark skin, his quiet demeanor, his lack of obvious wealth. She stopped 3 feet from the table and stared at him like he was a stain on her perfect afternoon. "Excuse me?" Her voice was loud enough to turn heads at nearby tables. "Why is that man sitting at my table?" The event coordinator hurried over, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Miss Harlan, this is Mr. Isaiah Mercer. His invitation specifically requested—" "I don't care what his invitation says." Brooke's voice rose higher. "I want to know why he's sitting next to me." Conversation stopped at the surrounding tables. Guests turned to stare. Cell phones lifted discreetly as people sensed drama brewing. The string quartet continued playing, but their music seemed suddenly out of place. Isaiah remained perfectly still. He didn't defend himself or demand explanations. He simply observed the cameras focusing on him, the security guards stepping closer, the donors whispering behind their champagne flutes. His expression never changed. Across the garden, Conrad and Renata finally noticed the commotion. Instead of looking concerned, they began to smile. Conrad leaned over to whisper something in his wife's ear. Renata covered her mouth with her hand, but her shoulders shook with suppressed laughter. They thought this was entertaining. "I'm not sitting there," Brooke declared, pointing at her chair like it was contaminated. "Remove his place setting. Move him somewhere else. I don't care where, just not next to me." The coordinator's face went pale. Other staff members gathered nervously, unsure how to handle a situation that was spinning out of control in front of 500 witnesses and multiple cameras. Isaiah folded his hands in his lap and waited. He had learned long ago that patient observation revealed more than angry words ever could. Today, the Harlan family was about to reveal exactly who they really were, and he was going to remember every single detail. Brooke crossed her arms and glared at the event staff. "I said remove that chair. Now, before lunch starts, I want him gone from my table." The cameras kept rolling, the guests kept staring, and Isaiah Mercer kept watching everything with the calm attention of a man who had seen this kind of cruelty before. The garden fell silent except for the soft clink of champagne glasses and the distant hum of catering staff. 500 guests turned their attention toward the front table where Brooke Harlan stood like a queen delivering judgment. Her red dress blazed against the white flowers and gold chairs, making her the undeniable center of attention. She loved every second of it. "This is ridiculous," Brooke announced, her voice carrying across the entire garden. "Someone clearly made a mistake with the seating arrangements. This table is reserved for the Harlan family and our closest partners." She gestured toward Isaiah without looking directly at him. "Important families who actually belong here." A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others pulled out their phones, pretending to check messages while secretly recording. The event coordinator wrung her hands, glancing desperately between Brooke and the growing crowd of onlookers. Isaiah sat perfectly still, his hands resting calmly on the white tablecloth. He didn't defend himself or argue. He simply watched Brooke perform for her audience, noting how she fed off their attention like fuel. "I mean, honestly," Brooke continued, her voice dripping with theatrical disbelief. "Did security even check his invitation? Or did he just wander in here hoping no one would notice?" She laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the garden's elegance. Maybe he thought if he dressed up nice enough, he could sneak into a real charity event. Several wealthy guests chuckled nervously. They looked around at each other, unsure whether this was acceptable behavior or a social disaster they should distance themselves from. But none of them stood up for Isaiah. None of them questioned Brooke's cruelty. Across the garden, Conrad Harlan watched his daughter's performance with obvious amusement. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his champagne like he was enjoying dinner theater. When a donor beside him looked concerned, Conrad waved dismissively. "Brooke has always been spirited," he said loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "She knows quality when she sees it." That was all the permission Brooke needed. She turned toward Isaiah with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Then, with deliberate slowness, she raised her middle finger at him. The gesture was brief but unmistakable, captured by at least a dozen cell phone cameras. "Whoops," she said with mock innocence. "Sorry about that. Just stretching." More nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Some guests looked genuinely shocked, but others seemed to find Brooke's boldness entertaining. The cameras kept rolling. Conrad chuckled from across the garden and stood up, adjusting his silk tie as he approached the front table. His smile was polished and practiced, the kind that had charmed investors and politicians for decades. Now, he said with fatherly indulgence, "let's not make our guest uncomfortable." He looked down at Isaiah with the same expression he might use for a lost child. "I'm sure there are other seats that would be more suitable for you. Perhaps something toward the back, near the staff tables? You'd probably be more comfortable there anyway." Renata glided over to join her husband, her champagne-colored dress flowing like liquid silk. She placed a protective hand on Brooke's shoulder and smiled at Isaiah with Arctic politeness. "Brooke is such a passionate advocate for our foundation," she said sweetly. "She just wants to make sure everyone finds their proper place at our little gathering." Her tone made it clear that Isaiah's proper place was anywhere but here. The server who had been trying to mediate the situation looked mortified. Her face was flushed red, and her hands shook slightly as she held her notepad. She kept glancing between the powerful family and the quiet man they were humiliating, clearly torn between her job and her conscience. Isaiah noticed her distress. For the first time since the confrontation began, he spoke. "Excuse me," he said gently, looking up at the server. "What's your name?" The young woman blinked in surprise. "Sarah," she whispered. "Thank you, Sarah," Isaiah said with genuine warmth. "You've been nothing but professional and kind today. I appreciate how you've treated me with respect." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. In a room full of wealthy, powerful people, the only person showing her basic human decency was the man they were all trying to humiliate. Brooke rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, please. Are we really going to have a touching moment with the help now?" Conrad nodded to the event staff. "Let's get this sorted out, shall we? Remove the extra place setting. Brooke shouldn't have to deal with this confusion any longer." Two staff members hurried forward and quickly pulled Isaiah's chair away from the table. They moved his place setting to a cart like they were clearing debris. The action was swift and efficient, designed to minimize further embarrassment for the Harlan family. Brooke immediately sat down in her chair, smoothing her red dress with satisfaction. She picked up her champagne flute and raised it toward the crowd like she had just won a victory. "Much better," she announced. "Now we can have a proper lunch." Isaiah stood slowly, straightening his navy suit jacket with calm dignity. He didn't look angry or defeated. He simply walked toward the stage at the front of the garden, his steps measured and purposeful. The crowd watched him go, unsure what to expect next. Some probably assumed he was leaving in humiliation. Others might have thought he was heading to complain to event security. None of them guessed the truth. Isaiah reached the stage and paused at the steps, his hand resting lightly on the railing. He turned back toward the garden one last time, his eyes finding Brooke's confident smile, Conrad's amused expression, and Renata's cold satisfaction. Then he began climbing the steps toward the microphone. Conrad strode onto the stage with the confidence of a man who had never truly faced consequences. His silver hair caught the afternoon sunlight as he adjusted the microphone, tapping it twice to get the crowd's attention. The murmur of conversation died down as donors, city officials, and reporters turned toward the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," Conrad began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of decades in boardrooms and political fundraisers. "Thank you all for joining us today for what I can only describe as a historic moment for our city." He gestured broadly toward the garden filled with white-clothed tables and champagne glasses. Behind him, a massive banner displayed the Harlan Harbor Renewal Project logo, sleek towers rising from waterfront property that had been underdeveloped for years. The Harlan Harbor Renewal Project represents more than just construction, Conrad continued, his tone growing more passionate. It represents opportunity, jobs for our community, housing for young families, commerce that will benefit everyone. Brooke beamed from her front table, raising her champagne glass slightly toward her father. She had completely forgotten about the man she had just humiliated, basking instead in the applause that followed Conrad's opening remarks. But most importantly, Conrad said, pausing for dramatic effect, "Today I can officially announce that we have secured the full $850 million financing package that will make this dream a reality." The crowd erupted in enthusiastic applause. Cameras flashed as reporters scribbled notes. City council members nodded approvingly. Several major donors stood up to clap, their faces bright with the satisfaction of backing a winning project. Conrad raised his hand to quiet the celebration. This financing represents not just an investment in buildings and infrastructure, but an investment in integrity, in partnership, in the kind of legacy we want to leave for future generations. Renata dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, playing the role of the proud wife to perfection. She had orchestrated charity events for years, but this moment represented the culmination of months of careful planning and relationship building. The Harlan family has always believed that true success comes from, "Excuse me." The voice was calm but clear, cutting through Conrad's speech like a blade. Every head in the garden turned toward the stage, where Isaiah Mercer stood near the microphone, his navy suit immaculate, despite the afternoon's humiliation. Conrad's smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. "I'm sorry, but this is a private presentation. Security will help you find your way." "That won't be necessary," Isaiah said, stepping closer to the microphone. His voice carried easily across the silent garden without any amplification. "I believe I have something relevant to add to your announcement about the financing." Conrad moved to block Isaiah's path to the podium, but Isaiah didn't push or argue. He simply stood his ground with the kind of quiet authority that made people pay attention despite themselves. "Sir, I don't know who you are, but my name is Isaiah Mercer," he said clearly, his words reaching every corner of the garden. "I am the chairman and majority shareholder of Mercer Dominion Capital." The name hit the crowd like a physical blow. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. Even the servers stopped moving, sensing that something enormous was happening. Brooke's face went white. Her champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against the ground, sending crystal fragments across the white tablecloth. She stared at Isaiah with the dawning horror of someone who had just realized they had made a catastrophic mistake. Conrad's confident smile disappeared entirely. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and then pure panic. "Mercer Dominion Capital," Isaiah continued in the same calm tone, "is the controlling financier behind the Harlan Harbor Renewal Project. The $850 million package your father just announced, that money comes from my company." The silence stretched so long that individual sounds became amplified. A car horn from the street, the distant buzz of a helicopter, someone's phone vibrating against a table. "However," Isaiah said, his voice carrying a note of steel that hadn't been there before, "the financing agreement contains specific clauses regarding the moral conduct and leadership standards expected from all Harlan family members in public-facing roles." Conrad tried to speak, but no words came out. His mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. "Based on what I have witnessed here today," Isaiah continued, "the Harlan family has demonstrated conduct that violates these standards in a manner that makes continued partnership impossible." Brooke stood up so quickly that her chair toppled backward. "Wait, no, I was just—" "Therefore," Isaiah said, his words cutting through her protest, "effective immediately, the financing agreement for the Harlan Harbor Renewal Project is terminated." The garden erupted. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. Donors began talking frantically among themselves. City officials looked around in confusion, trying to understand what had just happened to a project they had been publicly supporting for months. Conrad's phone began ringing, then another phone at his table, then a third. The sound of multiple ringtones created a chaotic symphony as banks, board members, and investors began calling with panicked questions about what they had just witnessed. 20 minutes after the canceled announcement, the garden venue had transformed from a celebration into a battlefield. Most guests remained scattered around the white-draped tables, their conversations hushed but intense as they tried to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Reporters clustered near the stage, furiously typing on their phones and tablets. City officials huddled together by the champagne bar, clearly trying to figure out how to distance themselves from a project that had just imploded in public. Isaiah stood near the marble fountain at the center of the garden, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the chaos unfold around him. He appeared completely calm, as if he were observing someone else's crisis, rather than standing at the center of his own storm. Conrad had recovered from his initial shock and was now moving with purpose. Harlan security guards, 6 men in black suits with earpieces, had quietly positioned themselves in a loose circle around Isaiah. They weren't threatening him directly, but their message was clear. He wasn't leaving until the Harlans said he could leave. "You think you're clever," Conrad said, striding up to Isaiah with his face red from anger and embarrassment. "You think you can waltz into my event, humiliate my family, and destroy a legitimate business deal without consequences?" Isaiah turned to face him with the same measured expression he had maintained all afternoon. "I think I can hold your family accountable for their actions." "Accountable?" Conrad's voice rose loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "You orchestrated this entire situation. You came here with the intention of creating a scene so you could manufacture some excuse to break our agreement." Brooke appeared at her father's side, her red dress wrinkled and her makeup slightly smeared from tears of rage. "He planned this whole thing," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "He probably isn't even really insulted. He's just trying to—" She stopped mid-sentence, her hand flying to her wrist. "Wait, where's my bracelet?" She looked down at her bare wrist with theatrical shock, then began scanning the ground around her feet. "My diamond bracelet is gone, the one grandmother left me. It was right here on my wrist during the luncheon." Renata rushed over, her face a mask of concerned motherly worry. "Sweetheart, are you certain? Maybe it fell off somewhere else?" "No, I had it when that man was sitting next to me," Brooke said, pointing directly at Isaiah. "It's a family heirloom, worth more than most people make in a year." One of the security guards, a tall man with a shaved head and cold eyes, stepped forward. "Mr. Harlan, we should check the area where the gentleman was seated earlier." Conrad nodded grimly. "Do it." The guard walked over to where Isaiah's chair had been removed from the Harlan family table. He bent down, appearing to search carefully through the grass and around the table legs. After a moment, he straightened up with something glinting in his palm. "Found it," he announced, holding up an elaborate diamond bracelet that caught the afternoon sunlight. "It was right here, tucked under the edge of the tablecloth near where his coat was hanging." Renata gasped audibly, pressing her hand to her chest in a gesture of shock that was perfectly timed for the cameras still recording nearby. "Oh my goodness, how could it have ended up there?" Several guests turned to stare at Isaiah, their expressions shifting from curiosity to suspicion. Whispered conversations rippled through the crowd as people began drawing their own conclusions about what they thought they were witnessing. Conrad stepped closer to Isaiah, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that still carried to the watching crowd. "So now we add theft to your list of crimes. You stage a public humiliation, cancel a legitimate business deal, and steal from my daughter, all in one afternoon." Isaiah looked at the bracelet in the guard's hand, then at Conrad's face, then at the crowd of wealthy donors who were now watching him with growing hostility. His expression never changed. "Interesting timing," he said quietly. "The timing is evidence," Conrad shot back. "You created a distraction with your little speech so you could pocket something valuable. Classic con man behavior." Brooke stepped forward, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks, though whether from genuine distress or calculated performance was impossible to tell. "That bracelet belonged to my great-grandmother. It's irreplaceable. How could you do something so cruel?" The crowd's mood was shifting rapidly. What had begun as sympathy for Isaiah after Brooke's initial rudeness was now transforming into suspicion and disapproval. Several guests shook their heads in disgust. A few began moving away from Isaiah as if his presence might contaminate them. Conrad sensed the change in atmosphere and pressed his advantage. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've witnessed here today is not a principled stand against injustice. It's an elaborate extortion scheme. This man came to our event with the specific intention of manufacturing a crisis so he could break a legal contract and damage my family's reputation." He turned back to Isaiah with a look of righteous anger. "But you made one crucial mistake. You got greedy. Canceling the deal wasn't enough for you. You had to steal something too. And that theft, witnessed by dozens of people and captured on multiple cameras, proves that everything else was premeditated fraud." Isaiah remained perfectly still as Conrad's accusations washed over him. He didn't deny anything. He didn't defend himself. He simply watched and listened as if he were taking notes on a fascinating but ultimately predictable performance. "My lawyers will be filing charges first thing tomorrow morning," Conrad continued. "Theft, fraud, breach of contract, and intentional interference with business relationships. Mercer Dominion Capital will be sued for every penny it's worth, and you personally will face criminal prosecution." The security guards shifted slightly closer, not quite touching Isaiah, but making it clear that any attempt to leave would be physically prevented. The photographers and reporters pressed forward, sensing that the story was far from over. Isaiah looked directly at the event photographer, a young woman with short blonde hair who had been documenting the entire afternoon. "I hope you haven't deleted any of the footage from today." She blinked in surprise at being addressed directly. "No, sir. Everything's still on my cameras." "Good. Please don't delete anything. And make sure you have backup copies stored in multiple locations." Conrad laughed harshly. "Planning to destroy evidence now? That's another crime to add to the list." Isaiah ignored him and turned to address the security guards surrounding him. "I'd like your names, please. All of you." The bald guard who had found the bracelet crossed his arms. "We don't have to tell you anything." "Actually, you do," Isaiah said calmly. "Since you've accused me of a crime in front of witnesses, I have the right to know who my accusers are. State law is quite clear on that point." Brooke smirked. clearly believing that Isaiah's calm demeanor proved he was rattled and trying to buy time. "You can learn our names from the police report," she said smugly, "right after they arrest you." Isaiah nodded thoughtfully, as if he found her response illuminating rather than threatening. He pulled out his phone and appeared to make a quick note, then slipped it back into his pocket. A woman in an elegant gray suit appeared at Isaiah's side, Miriam Vale, his chief legal strategist, who had apparently been waiting in the parking area. She was in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she had seen this type of situation before. "Mr. Mercer," she said quietly, "we should go." The security guards looked to Conrad, who nodded slightly. They stepped aside just enough to create a narrow path toward the garden's exit, making it clear that Isaiah was being allowed to leave rather than choosing to go freely. As Isaiah walked toward the garden gate with Miriam beside him, Brooke called out loud enough for everyone to hear, "Don't think this is over. My father's lawyers will destroy you for what you did today." Isaiah paused at the gate and turned back to look at the Harlan family, Conrad red-faced and triumphant, Renata elegant and coldly satisfied, Brooke practically glowing with vindictive pleasure. The crowd of wealthy guests watched him with a mixture of suspicion and disdain, clearly convinced they had just witnessed a con man being exposed and humiliated. "Miriam?" Isaiah said quietly as they walked through the gate toward their car. The Harlans just made their first provable mistake. That evening, Isaiah sat in the temporary command office he'd rented on the 32nd floor of a downtown high-rise. The floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the city lights, but his attention was focused on the 3 large monitors displaying legal documents, news feeds, and security footage from the afternoon's events. Miriam Vale paced back and forth behind his chair, her heels clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor. "They filed the penalty claim an hour ago," she said, holding up her tablet. $850 million, plus punitive damages for breach of contract and intentional interference with business relationships. They want it all within 72 hours. Roland Pierce, Isaiah's private investigator, sat at the conference table sorting through printed photographs and handwritten notes. He was a compact man in his early 50s with the kind of steady presence that came from years as a federal field agent. "The emergency filing gives us 3 days to prove legal justification for the cancellation," he said, without looking up from his work. "After that, arbitration gets messy." Miriam stopped pacing and turned to face Isaiah. "We need to hit back hard and fast. Public pressure, media interviews, social media campaign. Show them that 2 can play this game." Isaiah didn't look away from the monitors. "No, Isaiah, they're destroying your reputation while we sit here analyzing footage. Conrad's already got his people on 3 different news channels calling you a bitter opportunist who staged this whole thing for revenge. Let them talk." Miriam slammed her hand on the table. "This isn't the time for patience. They're painting you as unstable, vindictive, and desperate." Brooke posted a 20-minute video on Instagram calling herself the victim of public intimidation. It's got 500,000 views already. Isaiah finally turned in his chair to look at her. His expression was calm, but his voice carried quiet steel. "Miriam, I've been investigating financial crimes for 15 years. The moment you start reacting emotionally, you lose control of the evidence. The moment you lose control of the evidence, you lose the case." Roland nodded in agreement. "He's right. The Harlans want us angry and sloppy. They want us making accusations we can't prove." Isaiah stood up and walked to a whiteboard mounted on the opposite wall. He picked up a black marker and began writing in neat block letters. "Here's what we do. First, preserve every piece of footage from today. Event photographer, security cameras, guest cell phones, everything. Chain of custody matters." He wrote, "Witness identification," below the first item. "Second, get names and contact information for everyone who saw the bracelet accusation. Staff, guests, security guards. Interview them before the Harlan's lawyers get to them. Miriam watched him work, her anger slowly giving way to professional focus. What about the foundation records? Third priority, Isaiah said, adding it to the list. Brooks' charity claims to help disadvantaged youth. If there's fraud there, it supports the morality clause argument. He paused, marker hovering over the whiteboard. Roland, what did you find about the bracelet? Roland flipped through his photographs until he found what he was looking for. This is interesting. Look at this sequence. He spread 3 photos across the table. Photo 1, Brooke wearing the diamond bracelet at 2:15 p.m., clearly visible on her left wrist. Photo 2, same bracelet at 2:45, 30 minutes later. Isaiah and Miriam leaned in to examine the images more closely. Photo 3, Roland continued, taken at 3:05 p.m., 5 minutes before the accusation. No bracelet visible on either wrist. Miriam frowned. So when did it come off? That's where it gets interesting. Roland pulled up a video file on his laptop. Security footage from the east side of the garden. Watch the timestamp, 2:58 p.m. The grainy black and white footage showed the area near the dessert table where several security guards were stationed. Isaiah watched carefully as one of the guards, the same bald man who had later found the bracelet, approached Brooke and appeared to speak with her briefly. He's not searching for anything, Isaiah observed. He's coordinating with her. Gets better, Roland said. Same guard, 3 minutes later. He fast-forwarded the footage. Watch his hands. On screen, the guard could be seen handling something small and glittery before walking toward the area where Isaiah's coat was hanging. Miriam whistled softly. They planted it. Isaiah added bracelet coordination to the whiteboard, then underlined it twice. The Harlans made their first provable mistake when they got greedy. The insult and the contract cancellation were emotional, but framing me for theft? That's criminal conspiracy. His phone buzzed. The caller ID showed unknown number. Isaiah answered on the 3rd ring. Mercer. The voice on the other end was elderly, female, and nervous. Mr. Mercer, my name is Grace Whitcomb. I used to work for the Harlan family. I think you need to know some things about your mother. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and old grease. Isaiah sat in a corner booth, his back to the wall, watching the door. At 6:30 in the morning, the place was nearly empty except for a few construction workers grabbing breakfast before their shifts. Grace Whitcomb walked in exactly on time. She was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 5'4", with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her hands shook slightly as she slid into the booth across from him. "Thank you for meeting me," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Isaiah poured her a cup of coffee from the pot the waitress had left on the table. "You mentioned my mother." Grace wrapped her fingers around the warm mug. "Althea was a good woman, honest. That's why they destroyed her." She looked up at him with tired eyes. "And why they'll try to destroy you, too. Tell me about the foundation." Grace glanced around the diner before continuing. "Brooks' charity is just the pretty face they show the world. Clean fundraisers, beautiful websites, smiling photographs with children. But underneath?" She shook her head. "It's rotten all the way down." Isaiah pulled out a small recording device and set it on the table between them. "Do you mind?" Grace nodded her consent. "The real money never goes to the kids. It moves through consulting firms, travel expenses, event planning companies, all owned by Renata's friends or shell companies Conrad controls. What about the scholarship recipients? Most of them don't exist. The ones that do get a few $100s and a nice photograph for the website. Meanwhile, Renata spends $50,000 on a single gala dinner." Grace's voice grew bitter. "And the children who really need help? The ones from families Conrad's projects displaced? Their applications get rejected automatically." Isaiah felt something cold settle in his stomach. Displaced families? Harlan Harbor wasn't empty land, Mr. Mercer. 43 families lived there. Working families, most of them black. some Hispanic. Conrad promised them relocation assistance, temporary housing, help with deposits for new places. Grace pulled a folded piece of paper from her purse. Instead, he had the city condemn their homes as structurally unsafe and evict them with 30 days' notice. Isaiah studied the paper. It was a copy of a city notice dated 2 years earlier. Where did these families go? Shelters, relatives' couches. Some left town entirely. Grace's hands tightened around her coffee cup. A grandmother named Ruth Bellamy wrote letters to the foundation for months, begging for help. Her grandson was supposed to start college. Good grades, clean record, everything. The foundation sent back a form letter saying his application didn't meet their standards. Roland had been listening quietly from the next booth over, pretending to read a newspaper. Now he leaned forward slightly, still maintaining his cover but clearly focused on every word. "Ruth still has the letters?" Isaiah asked. "All of them, and photographs of the old neighborhood, and the eviction notices." Grace's voice dropped to a whisper. "But that's not the worst part, Mr. Mercer. The foundation is just covering something much bigger, something that goes back 30 years to when your mother worked for Conrad's father." Isaiah set down his coffee cup. What did she find? Grace looked directly into his eyes. The original crime, the one that built everything they own. The First Baptist Church of Oak Hills sat on a quiet corner, its red brick walls worn smooth by decades of rain and wind. Grace led Isaiah through a side entrance, past empty Sunday school rooms, and into a basement that smelled of old paper and dust. "I volunteered here for 20 years after I retired," Grace explained, pulling a chain to turn on a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. "The pastor let me use this space to organize historical documents, church records, neighborhood histories, old business papers people donated instead of throwing away." She walked to a metal filing cabinet in the corner and pulled out a thick manila folder. "Your mother's employment records. I saved copies of everything before the Harlans could destroy them all." Isaiah took the folder with steady hands, though his heart was racing. Inside were payroll stubs, performance reviews, and carbon copies of memos written in his mother's careful handwriting. At the bottom was a black-and-white employee photograph, Althea Mercer at 28, wearing a simple dress and looking directly at the camera with quiet dignity. "She was the best accountant Richard Harlan ever hired," Grace said. "Honest, thorough, never missed a detail. That's exactly why she was dangerous to them." Isaiah studied a memo dated 31 years earlier. His mother had discovered discrepancies in land acquisition records for the original Harlan Harbor development. Families had been paid far below market value for their properties, sometimes with forged signatures on transfer documents. "The Pinewood District," Grace continued. 47 black families owned small homes and businesses there. Your mother found evidence that Conrad's father used intimidation, fake legal threats, and outright fraud to force them out for pennies on the dollar. Isaiah's jaw tightened as he read his mother's careful notes documenting each irregularity. Property values deliberately underassessed, transfer dates that didn't match notary stamps, bank deposits that never reached the original owners. "She brought this to Richard Harlan directly," Grace said, "told him she had a legal obligation to report the fraud to the state. He promised her he'd make it right, investigate personally, hold people accountable. But he didn't." 2 weeks later, $5,000 went missing from the company payroll account. Richard claimed your mother had stolen it to cover gambling debts. Grace's voice turned bitter. Gambling debts she never had. The man barely drank coffee, let alone gambled. Isaiah felt his mother's integrity burning through every page of documentation. Performance reviews calling her exceptionally reliable and morally uncompromising. Commendation letters for catching other employees' mistakes and saving the company money. They destroyed her reputation completely, Grace continued, made sure no other accounting firm in the state would hire her. She ended up cleaning offices at night just to feed you. Isaiah closed the folder carefully, his hands completely steady despite the rage building in his chest. Where are the original ledgers? Grace reached into her coat pocket and pulled out an old brass key. Storage unit on Maple Street. Building's been abandoned for 10 years, but the basement stays dry. I hid the real evidence there before Richard could have it all burned. She placed the key in Isaiah's palm. Your mother died, believing the world thought she was a thief, but you have the power to change that now. Isaiah looked down at his mother's photograph one more time. Althea Mercer stared back at him with the same quiet strength he'd inherited, the same refusal to be broken that had carried him through decades of building toward this moment. I promise you, Grace, he said quietly, slipping the photograph into his jacket pocket next to his heart. Before this is over, everyone will know my mother's real name. The Harlan Grand Hotel's executive dining room sat on the 15th floor, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city's glittering lights. Conrad had reserved the entire space for their private meeting, ensuring no other guests could witness their conversation. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over polished mahogany tables, but the elegance felt cold and calculated. Isaiah arrived precisely on time, dressed in a charcoal suit and silver cufflinks that matched his watch. He noted the single security guard posted outside the dining room doors and the fact that no hotel staff remained inside once their meals were served. Conrad rose from his chair with practiced charm, extending his hand as if they were old friends. Isaiah, thank you for coming. I thought it was time we talked like reasonable businessmen. Reasonable men don't usually require sealed rooms, Isaiah replied, shaking Conrad's hand briefly before taking his seat across the table. The first course arrived without conversation, seared scallops on bone china plates that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Conrad cut into his food with careful precision, his movements as calculated as his words. I want to apologize for my daughter's behavior, Conrad began, his voice smooth and diplomatic. Brooke is young, impulsive. She doesn't understand how the real world works yet. Isaiah said nothing, simply watching Conrad's face for the tells that came with practiced lies, the slight tightening around the eyes, the pause before speaking, the way his left hand stayed perfectly still while his right gestured. I'm prepared to offer you a substantial private settlement, Conrad continued, $15 million, paid immediately, in exchange for restoring our financing agreement, plus a personal apology from Brooke, written and delivered however you prefer. And in return, a simple non-disclosure agreement. What happened at the garden event stays between us. No public statements, no media interviews, no legal actions based on personal grievances. Isaiah cut a piece of his scallop and chewed slowly, letting the silence stretch. Conrad's confidence began to show cracks around the edges. That's a generous offer, Isaiah finally said, for a simple insult between strangers. Conrad's smile tightened. I believe in solving problems efficiently. What problems are those exactly? Look, Isaiah. Conrad's voice lost some of its diplomatic polish. You canceled an $850 million deal because a 23-year-old girl hurt your feelings. That's not business. That's personal. Isaiah leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged. You seem to know quite a bit about my motivations. I know enough. Conrad's mask began slipping entirely. I know you've been asking questions about my family's history, digging through old records, bothering retired employees. Which employees? Conrad caught himself, realizing he'd revealed more than intended. It doesn't matter. The past is the past, Isaiah. Ancient history has no place in modern business. Ancient history? Isaiah repeated thoughtfully. Like employment records from 31 years ago? Conrad's fork paused halfway to his mouth. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you do. You just mentioned that I was digging through old records. Which specific records concerned you enough to monitor my activities? The dining room fell completely silent except for the distant hum of traffic 15 floors below. Conrad set down his fork and stared directly at Isaiah, all pretense of friendliness gone. "Let me be very clear," Conrad said, his voice turning ice-cold. "If you don't restore our deal and sign that non-disclosure agreement, I will destroy you. I'll have your business licenses challenged in every state where you operate. I'll make sure every bank in the country questions your integrity. And I'll make absolutely sure that every newspaper in America knows the real story about your thieving mother." Isaiah's expression never changed, but his right hand moved slightly, adjusting his cufflink to ensure optimal recording position. Under his state's consent laws, he could legally record any conversation he was part of. "Tell me about my mother's real story," Isaiah said quietly. "Althea Mercer was a criminal who stole company money to cover her gambling debts. She was fired, disgraced, and died, knowing everyone saw her for what she really was, a liar and a thief." "Interesting. How do you know so much about her employment termination? That was your father's company, and you would have been 28 at the time." Conrad realized his mistake immediately. His knowledge of specific details about Althea's case suggested involvement that went beyond casual family history. "I reviewed the files when I took over the company," Conrad said quickly. "Which files? I thought all employment records from that period were destroyed in a fire." Conrad's face flushed red. "They were, but you just threatened to make her story famous again. How can you publicize records that no longer exist?" At the hotel bar 30 feet away, visible through the dining room's glass partition, Renata Harlan sat nursing a martini while typing rapidly on her phone. Isaiah noticed her presence but gave no indication he'd seen her. Conrad stood abruptly, abandoning any attempt at diplomacy. "You have 72 hours to restore our deal, Isaiah. After that, I promise you'll regret ever hearing the Harlan name." Isaiah rose calmly, straightening his jacket. "Thank you for dinner, Conrad, and for the conversation." He walked toward the exit without looking back, knowing that every word had been captured clearly on his recording device. Conrad's threats, his knowledge of supposedly destroyed documents, and his intimate familiarity with Althea Mercer's case were now preserved as evidence. As Isaiah stepped into the hotel elevator, he caught a glimpse of Renata through the closing doors, still typing urgently on her phone. Her fingers moved with the speed of someone delivering critical information to a contact who needed to act quickly. The elevator descended in silence, carrying Isaiah toward the hotel's marble lobby and the valet station where his car waited. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the city's evening traffic flowing along the streets below, including a familiar black SUV idling near the hotel's side entrance. Isaiah collected his keys from the valet, tipped the young man respectfully, and walked to his car without hurrying. As he pulled out of the hotel's circular driveway and merged into traffic, the black SUV fell into position 3 cars behind him, its headlights reflecting steadily in his rearview mirror. 20 minutes after leaving Conrad's hotel, Isaiah sat in his car outside Roland Pierce's downtown office building, speaking quietly into his phone. The evening rain drummed against his windshield, while streetlights cast wavering reflections on the wet pavement. "Roland, I need you and Grace ready to move tonight. We're going to the storage property." After what Conrad just threatened, Roland's voice carried the sharp edge of a man who'd spent decades reading danger signs. "That sounds like exactly what they want us to do. It's what we have to do. Conrad knows too much about records that supposedly don't exist. If those files are still there, they won't be tomorrow." Within 30 minutes, Roland had collected Grace from her modest apartment across town. She sat in the passenger seat of Roland's sedan, clutching a worn leather purse and staring out at the industrial landscape rolling past the windows. "I should have given you the key years ago," Grace said quietly. I should have spoken up when Althea was still alive. You're speaking up now, Isaiah replied from the back seat, his voice steady and reassuring. That's what matters. The storage facility sat on the outskirts of Harlan Harbor, surrounded by empty lots, chain-link fencing, and the skeletal remains of old warehouses. Rain-slicked streets reflected the glow of distant harbor lights as Roland navigated through a maze of industrial roads. Black SUV behind us, Roland said calmly, checking his mirrors. Same one from the hotel. Isaiah turned to look through the rear window. The vehicle maintained a steady distance, its headlights cutting through the rain like predatory eyes. Take Harbor Junction Road, Isaiah instructed. There's a side route through the old shipping district. Roland made the turn onto a narrow road lined with abandoned loading docks and rusted shipping containers. The SUV followed, but as they approached a particularly dark stretch near an old rail crossing, it suddenly accelerated. Hold on, Roland warned. The SUV pulled alongside them, forcing Roland toward the shoulder. He fought the steering wheel as their car skidded on the wet asphalt, tires squealing against the pavement. Metal scraped against metal as the SUV pushed them toward a concrete curb. Roland managed to avoid a direct collision by swerving onto a service road, but their car bumped hard against the curb before coming to a stop. The SUV sped away immediately, disappearing into the maze of industrial streets. Everyone okay? Isaiah asked, already unbuckling his seatbelt. Grace nodded shakily while Roland checked for damage. Isaiah stepped out into the rain and walked back toward the road, his eyes scanning the area methodically. Across the street, a closed storefront's large window reflected the wet pavement and overhead lights. There, captured in the glass like a photograph, was the SUV's license plate perfectly reflected from when it had passed under a streetlight moments earlier. Isaiah pulled out his phone and took several clear pictures of the reflection, ensuring the plate numbers were readable. Evidence preserved before emotion, always. 20 minutes later, they reached the storage facility. Grace's key opened a heavy padlock on a weathered metal door. Inside, cardboard boxes sat stacked on metal shelving, some showing water damage from roof leaks. "These haven't been touched in 15 years, Grace whispered, pulling open the first box with trembling hands. Isaiah lifted out old payroll ledgers, their pages yellowed but still legible. Roland found a box containing surveyor maps of the harbor area, with property boundaries marked in different colored ink. Grace gasped when she discovered a manila folder with A. Mercer Development Analysis, written in her own handwriting from decades past. "I saved this when they fired her," Grace said, her voice breaking. "I knew she was right about the deeds." Inside the folder were handwritten notes in Althea's careful script, documenting discrepancies in property transfers, and questioning the legal ownership of several key lots near the harbor. Her calculations showed that multiple families had been forced off land they legally owned. Isaiah was photographing a deed copy with his mother's notations when Roland suddenly looked up from where he was documenting their discoveries. "Smoke," Roland said tersely. Gray wisps were seeping under the door from the back room. The acrid smell of burning paper and accelerant filled the air quickly. "Someone's torching the place," Roland continued, already moving toward the exit. "We need to go now." Isaiah grabbed the most important ledger box, while Grace clutched the folder containing Althea's maps. Roland pulled out his phone to record the fire's progression, capturing evidence of deliberate destruction. Smoke thickened rapidly as they moved toward the door. Through the growing haze, Isaiah could see flames beginning to lick at the back wall where additional records were stored. They emerged into the rain-soaked night, Isaiah carrying the heavy box of documents while Roland continued filming, and Grace pressed Althea's marked map against her chest, like a shield against the past. Behind them, orange light began flickering in the storage building's windows as the fire spread through decades of buried secrets. The morning sun cast long shadows across the command office as Isaiah's team spread the salvaged records across every available table. Water-damaged ledgers lay open beside modern laptops. Grace sat carefully turning brittle pages, while Roland enhanced digital photographs on multiple monitors. The deed transfers show a clear pattern, Miriam said, pointing to a series of documents. Conrad's father systematically pressured families to sell below market value, then flipped the properties to developers at massive profits. Isaiah studied his mother's handwritten notes in the margins of a 1987 property survey. Althea's careful script documented meeting dates, phone calls, and promises made to displaced families that were never kept. She knew exactly what they were doing, Isaiah said quietly. Every calculation, every discrepancy, every lie. Grace looked up from a box of correspondence. Your mother kept copies of everything. She was building a case before they destroyed her. The office phone rang. Miriam answered, then covered the receiver with her hand. It's Silas Drove, she whispered. He says he needs to meet immediately. Isaiah nodded. Within an hour, Silas sat across from Miriam in a downtown coffee shop, his hands shaking as he slid a flash drive across the table. I can't do this anymore, Silas said, his voice barely above a whisper. Conrad used Brooks' Foundation accounts to move money while he prepared the company for bankruptcy. He thought the charity status would protect the transfers from creditor review. Miriam examined the drive. What's on here? Bank records, wire transfers, shell company formations, everything showing how Conrad funneled development funds through the Harlan Foundation while claiming the company was financially stable for your deal. Silas wiped sweat from his forehead despite the air conditioning. There's more. The bracelet incident at the charity event? Conrad ordered security to plant it near Isaiah's coat. He wanted grounds to claim Isaiah was unstable and vindictive. You're willing to testify to all of this? Miriam asked. In court, under oath. I have copies of everything stored safely. Silas stood to leave, but we need to move fast. Conrad suspects I'm talking to someone. Back at the command office, excitement filled the air as Miriam shared Silas's information. Roland had successfully enhanced the security footage showing the bracelet being planted. Grace had organized testimony from 3 families whose scholarship applications were rejected by Brooks' Foundation, despite meeting all published criteria. We can file for emergency arbitration this afternoon, Miriam said. With Silas's testimony and these records, we can prove fraud, retaliation, and breach of contract. The Harlan's penalty claim won't survive 20 minutes of cross-examination. Isaiah walked to the window overlooking the city. For the first time in weeks, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. He pulled out his wallet and removed a small photograph of his mother taken at her college graduation. Her proud smile looked back at him. Tomorrow, they'll have to say your name correctly, he whispered to the photograph. That afternoon, the courthouse buzzed with activity as lawyers filed into the emergency arbitration hearing. Isaiah sat calmly at the plaintiff's table while Conrad and Renata whispered urgently with their legal team across the room. The heavy courtroom doors opened, and Silas Drove entered carrying a sealed manila folder. He looked directly at Isaiah's table, then walked toward the witness area. Conrad smiled slightly, as if he already knew exactly what Silas would say. The arbitration courtroom felt smaller than Isaiah expected, its wood-paneled walls closing in as the afternoon light filtered through narrow windows. He sat beside Miriam at the plaintiff's table, watching Conrad, Renata, and Brooke huddle with their team of lawyers across the narrow aisle. The arbitrator, Judge Patricia Kellerman, called the session to order. Her gray hair was pulled back severely, and her reading glasses caught the light as she reviewed the emergency filing. Mr. Drove, please take the stand, she said. Silas walked forward slowly, his earlier confidence completely gone. He avoided Isaiah's eyes as he placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. The manila folder sat unopened on the witness table. Conrad's lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Vincent Torres, approached the stand with theatrical confidence. Mr. Drove, how long have you worked as CFO for Harlan Global Properties? 15 years, Silas answered, his voice barely audible. And during that time, have you ever been pressured by outside parties to falsify company records? Silas's hands trembled as he reached for his water glass. Yes, recently. Isaiah felt Miriam stiffen beside him. This wasn't the testimony they'd prepared for. Can you tell the court who pressured you? Silas finally looked across the room, his eyes meeting Isaiah's for just a moment. Isaiah Mercer and his team. They demanded I create false documents showing financial irregularities at Harlan Global. When I refused, they threatened to destroy my career. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Miriam shot to her feet. Objection! This testimony contradicts Mr. Drove's sworn statement to my office yesterday. Judge Kellerman banged her gavel. Mr. Torres, do you have evidence supporting these claims? We do, Your Honor. Torres clicked a remote, and a large screen descended from the ceiling. Grainy security footage began playing, showing figures moving through the storage building where Isaiah's team had recovered the documents. This footage shows Mr. Mercer's associates deliberately setting fires to destroy evidence that would contradict their fabricated narrative, Torres said smoothly. Isaiah watched the edited video in stunned silence. The footage had been cut and spliced to make it appear that Roland was carrying accelerant instead of document boxes. The timestamp showed their team entering the building, but not the black SUV that had followed them there. Your Honor, this footage has clearly been manipulated, Miriam protested, but Torres was already moving to his next exhibit. We also have documentation showing the original accusations against Mr. Mercer's mother were thoroughly investigated and substantiated, Torres continued. Through the courtroom's glass doors, Isaiah could see Renata Harlan speaking to a cluster of reporters in the hallway. She held up a thick file folder, her elegant voice carrying just loudly enough for the microphones to catch her words about family theft and generational fraud. Judge Kellerman studied the documents Torres had submitted. Mr. Drove, you're stating under penalty of perjury that Mr. Mercer's team attempted to coerce you into providing false testimony. Yes, Your Honor. They said if I didn't cooperate, they would make sure I was charged as an accessory to whatever crimes they claimed my company had committed. Brooke leaned forward in her seat, close enough for Isaiah to hear her whispered words. Should have stayed in the back row where you belonged, just like your lying mother. Her voice was quiet, but Miriam caught every word. She scribbled notes frantically, documenting Brooke's continued pattern of discriminatory behavior even inside the courtroom. Judge Kellerman removed her glasses and cleaned them slowly. Given these serious allegations of evidence tampering and witness intimidation, I'm issuing a temporary restraining order, preventing the plaintiff from publicly using any documents recovered from the storage facility until their authenticity can be independently verified. Your Honor, we object in the strongest terms, Miriam said, standing again. Our client has been the victim of a coordinated campaign of "My ruling stands," Judge Kellerman said firmly. This hearing is adjourned pending forensic analysis of the disputed evidence. The gavel's bang echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Conrad stood and shook hands with his legal team, his satisfied smile visible to everyone in the room. Renata continued her impromptu press conference in the hallway, holding up photographs of Althea Mercer's original personnel file. Isaiah remained seated as the courtroom emptied around him. The weight of his mother's reputation being destroyed a second time settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. They've just lied under oath in federal arbitration, he said quietly to Miriam as cameras flashed through the courtroom windows. Every word Silas spoke was perjury. Every piece of evidence Torres submitted was falsified. Outside, hostile voices called his name as reporters pushed microphones toward his face. Isaiah walked through the crowd without speaking, but his mind was already working 3 steps ahead. The Harlans had won this round, but they'd also just handed him the rope to hang them with. The evening air felt thick with defeat as Isaiah's car pulled into the gravel parking lot behind St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. The old brick building stood dark against the night sky, its stained glass windows reflecting the streetlights like fractured jewels. Grace sat in the passenger seat, her weathered hands clutching a small brass key. "I never told you everything," Grace said quietly as they walked toward the church's side entrance. "About what your mother found, about where I really hid the most important pieces." Miriam followed close behind, her briefcase heavy with copies of the day's devastating testimony. "Grace, if there's something else, we need to know now. The forensic review could take months, and by then, Conrad will have destroyed everything that matters," Grace finished. She inserted the key into the church's heavy wooden door. "That's exactly what I was afraid of 30 years ago." The church's interior smelled of old wood and candle wax. Grace led them past rows of empty pews toward the altar, her footsteps echoing in the sacred silence. Behind the communion rail, she knelt beside a section of worn wooden flooring that looked identical to the rest. "Your mother knew Conrad would come looking," Grace said, running her fingers along the floorboards until she found a nearly invisible seam. "So we created 2 hiding places. The storage building was meant to be found eventually. This was meant to last forever." She pried up a loose board with the edge of the brass key. Beneath it lay a metal box wrapped in oiled cloth, small enough to fit in 2 hands, but heavy with the weight of hidden truth. "Althea had me witness these documents before she was fired," Grace continued, lifting the box carefully. "She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would keep them safe for her son. She said someday, you would need to know who you really were." Isaiah's hands trembled as he opened the box. Inside lay a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellow with age but perfectly preserved. The cover bore his mother's maiden name, Althea Montgomery. Below it, in careful handwriting, were the words, "Harlan Harbor Development Trust, Primary Beneficiary Records." "Oh my God," Miriam whispered as Isaiah opened the first page. The documents were meticulous. Notarized land deeds, transfer records bearing official state seals, survey maps showing property boundaries, and at the center of it all, a trust agreement dated 15 years before Conrad Harlan's first harbor development project. "The land was never theirs," Isaiah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The original families created a development trust before they lost their homes. My mother wasn't just an accountant. She was the trust administrator." Page after page revealed the stunning scope of the theft. Conrad's father hadn't simply displaced poor families from valuable waterfront property. He had stolen an entire community redevelopment plan that those families had spent years creating. Althea's detailed notes showed how she had discovered the original trust documents hidden in the company's own files. "She tried to return the land to the families who owned it," Grace said. "That's why Conrad's father destroyed her. Not because she stole something, because she found what they stole." The final page of the ledger contained a handwritten will, witnessed by Grace and 2 other church members. Althea Montgomery Mercer had legally transferred her position as primary trust beneficiary to her son, Isaiah Montgomery Mercer. "The Harlan Harbor project isn't being built on Conrad's land," Miriam said, reading over Isaiah's shoulder. "It's being built on yours." Isaiah photographed every page with his secure phone, then uploaded the images to encrypted servers controlled by 3 separate legal custodians. His treasury training had taught him never to trust a single copy of explosive evidence. "There's one more thing," Grace said, reaching into her coat pocket. "Your mother left this for you." She handed Isaiah a sealed envelope bearing his name in his mother's careful script. Inside was a single photograph, Althea Mercer standing in front of the Harlan Harbor waterfront, smiling beside a sign that read, "Future Site of Montgomery Community Center." On the back, in his mother's handwriting, "For Isaiah, the work continues." Isaiah looked up from the photograph to find Grace and Miriam watching him, with quiet respect. Outside, the church bells began to chime 9 o'clock. "Conrad's emergency investor meeting is tomorrow morning," he said, sliding the photograph into his jacket pocket. "He's planning to announce replacement financing and dismiss me as a bitter opportunist seeking revenge." Miriam smiled for the first time all day. "Should we file the ownership claim tonight?" "Not yet," Isaiah said, closing the ledger carefully. "I want to give Conrad one final chance to show everyone exactly who he really is." The Harlan Tower ballroom gleamed under crystal chandeliers. 200 investors filled round tables draped in ivory cloth. Conrad had chosen the setting carefully, his family's most impressive space, designed to project power and permanence. Isaiah entered through the main doors with Miriam, Roland, Grace, and 2 men in dark suits carrying briefcases. The independent auditors from Morrison and Associates moved with the quiet confidence of people who had testified before federal judges. "There he is," someone whispered near the back. "The guy who canceled the deal." Conrad stood at the podium wearing his finest navy suit, gold cufflinks catching the light. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this morning. Recent events have created unnecessary confusion about the Harlan Harbor project. I'm here to set the record straight." He gestured toward the architectural model displayed on a side table. "This development will proceed as planned. We have secured replacement financing from 3 major investment banks. The project timeline remains unchanged." Scattered applause rippled through the room. Isaiah found seats near the center aisle where everyone could see him clearly. "Some individuals have attempted to exploit a minor social misunderstanding for personal gain," Conrad continued, his eyes finding Isaiah. "They claim to represent justice, but their real motivation is bitterness over old family grievances." Brooke sat at the head table wearing a black designer dress and diamond earrings. Her hands clenched the table edge as she watched her father speak. "The Harlan family has contributed to this community for 3 generations," Conrad said. "We will not allow opportunists to destroy that legacy through manufactured scandals and false accusations." Several investors nodded approvingly. Conrad's confidence seemed to be working. Isaiah remained motionless in his chair, briefcase closed beside him. Grace sat to his left, hands folded over her purse. Roland scanned the room for security cameras and exit routes. "The previous financing partner violated our agreement through unprofessional conduct," Conrad declared. "Their decision to publicly embarrass my family was calculated to damage our reputation and extract favorable settlement terms." That was too much for Brooke. She pushed back her chair and stood up, her face flushed with anger. "Dad, why are you being so polite about this?" she called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Just tell them the truth." Conrad's smile faltered. "Brooke, please sit down." But she was already walking toward the microphone, her heels clicking against marble floors. Several investors turned their phones toward her, sensing drama. "My family built this city," Brooke announced, grabbing the microphone from her father. "We created jobs, funded charities, supported every major development project for decades. And this man," she pointed directly at Isaiah, "thinks he can destroy us because he got his feelings hurt at a dinner party?" Conrad reached for the microphone, but Brooke pulled it away. "We should never have let someone like him near our table or our business," she continued, her voice rising. "The Harlan Foundation represents excellence and tradition. We don't apologize for having standards." The room fell completely silent. Conrad's face had gone pale as he realized what his daughter had just done. Miriam leaned toward Isaiah and whispered, "She's legally listed as the Foundation's executive ambassador." Those words just became official corporate policy. Isaiah stood slowly and walked toward the audiovisual booth. "Excuse me," he said to the ballroom technician, "could you connect my evidence file to the main screen?" The massive projection screen flickered to life as Isaiah's laptop connected to the ballroom's audiovisual system. 200 investors, reporters, board members, and city officials stared at the blank white surface, waiting. "Ladies and gentlemen," Isaiah said, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone headset, "Ms. Harlan just stated that her family maintains standards. Let me show you what those standards actually look like." The first video filled the screen. Security footage from the charity event showing Brooke's diamond bracelet being carefully placed near Isaiah's coat by a man in a Harlan security uniform. The timestamp read 23 minutes before the bracelet was reported missing. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Brooke's mouth fell open as she watched herself on camera, pointing toward Isaiah while the security guard planted evidence behind him. This footage was recovered from the venue's backup server, Isaiah explained. Notice the coordination between the accusation and the placement. The screen switched to audio waveforms as Conrad's recorded voice filled the room. Reputations can be buried, licenses can be challenged, and old family stories can be rewritten. You should remember that your mother's name was Mud once before. Conrad gripped the podium, his knuckles white. Several board members exchanged alarmed glances. "That recording was made during our private dinner 3 nights ago," Isaiah continued. "Mr. Harlan threatened to destroy my business licenses and falsify my mother's historical record if I didn't withdraw my financing cancellation." The projection changed to bank transfer records showing money flowing from Harlan Foundation accounts into consulting firms owned by Renata's social circle. Highlighted amounts showed scholarship funds being redirected to event planning and administrative fees. The Harlan Foundation collected donations for disadvantaged youth scholarships, Isaiah said. 87% of those funds never reached students. Instead, they paid for galas, consultant fees, and personal expenses. Roland stepped forward with a manila folder. "We also have the SUV license plate from the vehicle that forced Mr. Mercer's car off the road near the storage facility. The registration traces to Harlan Global's private security contractor." Murmurs of shock rippled through the crowd. Several investors began gathering their papers and purses, but Isaiah wasn't finished. The screen displayed a yellowed church archive ledger beside modern architectural blueprints. "This is the community redevelopment model created by Althea Mercer in 1987, he announced. "Notice the harbor zoning proposal, mixed-income housing design, and waterfront public access requirements." The screen split to show Conrad's father's signature on development approval documents dated 6 months later, documents containing identical language and design specifications. "Althea Mercer didn't steal from the Harlans," Isaiah said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "The Harlans stole her life's work. They used her model to build their fortune, then destroyed her reputation to cover the theft." The ballroom doors opened as 3 people in dark suits entered, followed by uniformed officers. The lead investigator held up official documentation. "State Financial Crimes Unit," she announced. "We have seizure orders for all Harlan Foundation accounts and corporate records." Phones began buzzing throughout the room as bank representatives received emergency calls. The replacement financing Conrad had promised was being frozen in real time. Board member Harrison Webb stood up, his face grim. "Conrad Harlan, by emergency resolution of the Harlan Global Properties Board of Directors, you are hereby removed as chairman, effective immediately." Brooke screamed at her parents, her voice shrill with panic. "You said this wouldn't happen. You promised you'd protect me. Daddy, fix this. Fix this right now." Renata stared at the screen displaying her frozen foundation accounts, her elegant composure finally cracking. 1 week later, Isaiah stood at the podium of the rebuilt Harlan Harbor Community Hall, looking out at faces that had waited decades for this moment. The room buzzed with quiet anticipation as displaced families, elderly residents, young students, reporters, and city leaders filled every chair. The first change was visible immediately. where brass letters once spelled Harlan Harbor Renewal Project, a simple wooden sign now read Althea Mercer Community Trust. No gold trim, no corporate logos, just honest wood and clean paint. The Harlan name has been permanently removed from this project, Isaiah announced, his voice steady and clear. Conrad and Renata Harlan are facing federal fraud charges and civil restitution claims totaling $47 million. Their foundation assets remain frozen during the investigation. Scattered applause rippled through the room. Ruth Bellamy nodded from the third row, her weathered hands folded in her lap. Brooke Harlan has been stripped of all executive ambassador roles and banned from serving on any charitable board in this state for 10 years, Isaiah continued. Her social media platforms have been suspended pending the discrimination lawsuit. A reporter raised her hand. What about the original $850 million financing deal? Isaiah's expression didn't change. That deal will never be restored to the Harlan family. Instead, those funds are being redirected through the Althea Mercer Community Trust to serve the people this project was always meant to help. He gestured to architectural displays around the room showing affordable senior housing, small business incubation spaces, and a real scholarship center with transparent funding records. Silas Drove has agreed to full cooperation with investigators in exchange for reduced charges, Isaiah added. His testimony is helping prosecutors trace additional hidden assets that will fund victim restitution. Grace Whitcomb stood slowly, carrying a covered frame toward the front of the room. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was strong. Althea Mercer was a brilliant woman who believed communities could be rebuilt without pushing out the families who lived there first, Grace said. She drew these plans with love, not greed. She deserves to see her work finally completed. Grace pulled away the cloth, revealing a professional portrait of Althea Mercer in her 30s, wearing a navy blazer and holding architectural blueprints. Her eyes were kind but determined, much like her son's. The room fell silent as Grace mounted the portrait on the wall behind the head table. Althea's face would oversee every community meeting, every scholarship award, every family celebration held in this hall. Ruth Bellamy's grandson, Marcus, stepped forward with an official envelope. His grandmother had told him to dress nice today, but she hadn't explained why. "Marcus Bellamy," Isaiah called out, "you have been selected as the first recipient of the Althea Mercer Memorial Scholarship. Full tuition, books, and living expenses for 4 years of college." The young man's hands shook as he opened the letter. Ruth began crying quietly. 30 years of waiting, finally over. Isaiah walked to the head table where 2 chairs sat waiting. He took the seat on the right, leaving the chair on the left empty. That seat belonged to his mother, the woman the Harlans tried to erase, but could never truly defeat. Her name was on the building now. Her portrait watched over the room. Her son had won the war she started. The empty chair remained, and always would. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.